this evening. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our extended session on human trafficking. And our former WPS president, Dr. Farouk Mohiuddin, will moderate the session. Dr. Mohiuddin, the distinguished long-term member of WPS, is responsible for many exciting CME programs at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here today. Take it away, Farouk.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Rodolfo, and thank you for you and all your role in organizing these wonderful CME events. It's a pleasure to welcome everybody attending here. On behalf of the Washington Psychiatric Society and APNA DMV, which is the Association of Physicians of Pakistani Descent for DMV region, this is a joint effort. I can say that it's a pleasure to have the two presenters here. I have known Dr. Megan Gerbracht for a long time as a wonderful psychologist practicing in Virginia. But when I started to talk to her about the human trafficking and the problem that it is in the country, I realized how much she is instrumental in working on this topic and spreading the word and doing the work that is needed to stop this problem that is under-recognized, under-reported, and needs to be really highlighted. So when I found out about her interest in this, she was kind enough to introduce me to Joy Cover as well, the president of Freedom 424. And I'm going to read their CVs. But before I did that, I wanted to thank both of them for volunteering their time to educate us. I also wanted to let all the attendees know that Virginia Board of Medicine has a new requirement, which is to go ahead and make sure that you all get a human trafficking 1-hour CME. And this training will qualify for that. So you can keep track of this training for your license renewal for this cycle. In addition, we're going to be doing something which is very important, which we usually haven't done in the CMEs in the past, which is to do a pre-test and a post-test to see if the goal is for everybody attending this training to learn something and to take it back with them to their practices, wherever they practice, to recognize signs of human trafficking. So we'd request you to scan this pre-test that is on the screen right now for you. And please go ahead and take our pre-test. Then we will ask you to complete a post-test as well. We would greatly appreciate both because it gives us feedback how effective this training is, and we can learn to make it more effective. There's no grading on this. Everybody gets the CME whether you pass or fail the post-test. So please do the post-test. We appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two speakers in the interest of time. Dr. Megan Gerbracht, PsyD, is a licensed clinical psychologist in private practice in McLean, Virginia. She also sits on the board of directors for Reset 180, a local anti-human trafficking nonprofit that works to prevent commercial sexual exploitation, disrupting existing networks, and restore those who have been impacted. Dr. Gerbracht serves as a volunteer providing consultation to Reset 180 case managers and offers pro bono therapy for sex trafficking survivors. Dr. Gerbracht is also a member of the Virginia Coalition Against Human Trafficking, which is an alliance of service providers, attorneys, survivor advocates, and community members working on policy reform and enacting survivor-centered human trafficking legislation. Locally, she has organized community-wide presentations on reducing the demand for sex trafficking and the public health crisis of youth exposure to pornography. Dr. Gerbracht has also coordinating continuing education seminars with leading experts for mental health professionals on treating complex trauma with human trafficking survivors. Internationally, Dr. Gerbracht has collaborated with government officials and pastors in the Roma community of Burgas, Bulgaria, to provide training on human trafficking awareness and prevention. She is honored to be a part of the providing Virginia's first continuing education requirement for medical providers. I see a question in the chat, which is, I completed the pre-test before signing out, so I assume I don't have to do it again. Yes, you are right. And I also wanted to remind everyone, please stay muted during the presentation. And if you don't mind typing in your questions as the presentation goes along, and at the end, we'll be happy to stop a little early before the end and answer the questions that you enter in the chat. I'll be happy to read them. So please enter as many questions so we can have a robust discussion at the end. So that was regarding Dr. Megan Gerbracht, a accomplished professional and a good human being for working on this issue. and I'm going to talk about Joy Cover, who is the president of Freedom 424, a nonprofit organization with the mission to prevent and end sexual exploitation and trafficking locally and globally. The primary organizational focus is human trafficking prevention. Under Joy Cover's leadership, Freedom 424 has developed prevention education curriculum for youth, parents, and professional occupations that has been implemented on a global scale. Cover believes that the key to ending the crime of human trafficking is to equip those most vulnerable to recognize their vulnerabilities so steps can be taken to incorporate boundaries and protective factors. Cover wants to ensure that exploitation is never part of an individual's history. In addition to leading Freedom 424, Cover is also a member of the Virginia Coalition Against Human Trafficking, an alliance of service providers, attorneys, survivor advocates, and community members working on policy reform and enacting survivor-centered human trafficking legislation. Cover has worked in the nonprofit field since 2006, providing her with experience in identifying priority needs within a community, developing organizational strategy and education initiatives, incorporating strong program implementation and management at a domestic and international scale. Cover received her master's degree in public health with a focus on health promotion and disease prevention from Florida International University and her bachelor's degree in communications from Gardner-Webb University. Both accomplished presenters who have worked in this field for a long time. And I would like to welcome the two of you to take it from here. Since everybody's muted, you won't hear the applause, but I will do it on their behalf. Welcome and thank you for speaking on this important topic.
Thank you, Farouk.
Thank you for that amazing welcome. We're going to jump right in. Welcome to the healthcare training on human trafficking. The goal of this training is to provide a comprehensive understanding of human trafficking, especially as it pertains to all of you, those of you in the medical field. Recent national statistics show that up to 88% of trafficking victims do access healthcare while they're being trafficked. By the end of this training, you'll be able to define what human trafficking is and understand the main types of that trafficking, why it's important for you as medical professionals to know about human trafficking, and then how to spot and help any potential trafficking victims that you may encounter in your practice. I recognize that all of you probably see a lot of hard things, but we still issue a trigger warning. Some of the material in this presentation could be triggering. The training contains information pertaining to sexual violence, child sexual violence, rape, and other trauma-related materials. So if you do need to step away and take a breather, then rejoin us. Feel free to do that. Just briefly, so you know a little bit about Freedom 424, as was already shared, our mission is to prevent and end sexual exploitation and trafficking both locally and globally. We do that providing awareness, providing prevention education. Again, that's our bread and butter, our main focus as an organization. And then we expand the restoration work of our partners through grants, through trips, and any advocacy. We have the lofty goal of living in a world where human trafficking is completely eradicated and justice prevails. So we really aim to stop that exploitation before it ever starts. This is just a quick visual overview where it shows our main focus as an organization is in the prevention side of things, whereas our partners are on the restoration side, if God forbid that exploitation does occur. So we succeed as an organization when we stop the exploitation before it ever starts. That's why this presentation is such an honor to be part of, because we feel like equipping all of you to recognize it will help to put an end to it. So let's just jump right into this content. We have a lot to cover tonight. So despite the fact that human trafficking is a global issue, many are uninformed about what human trafficking actually is, how to recognize, how to help potential victims. And as healthcare professionals, you are on the front line of ending human trafficking. So through the education provided in this training, you'll have a comprehensive knowledge, hopefully, of human trafficking, but also we'll be able to learn how to spot those potential red flags that you might encounter during your work. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 was created to combat trafficking in persons, especially those in the sex trade, in slavery, and in involuntary servitude. Also to authorize certain federal programs to prevent violence against women and for other related purposes. This policy, the TVPA, was the first comprehensive federal law to address human trafficking in the United States, which is kind of shocking because, again, that was in 2000. The law provides a three-pronged approach that includes prevention, protection, and prosecution, and it also defines severe forms of trafficking, which would include both labor and sex trafficking. So this was a monumental piece of work. The TVPA has been reauthorized several times since 2000 through the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act to provide updated amendments to support prevention, protection, and prosecution of human trafficking. On the screen, you'll see the official definition of human trafficking according to the United Nations, and it is a lot of words. So we're going to read through that real quickly, but ultimately, we like to share this so that you have an understanding of what we're dealing with. Human trafficking is the act, the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, receipt of a person's by means, and the means is through threat, use of force, or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payment or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control of another person over another person, and that purpose is for exploitation. So exploitation shall include at a minimum the exploitation of the prostitution of others or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery and slavery-like practices, to slavery, servitude, and the removal of organs. So again, a lot of words, but put simply, human trafficking is any time a vulnerable person is exploited using force, fraud, or coercion. We will discuss this a little later when we define sex trafficking specifically, but the acts of provision, patronizing, and soliciting are specific to sex trafficking. This term, human trafficking, is an umbrella term that encompasses labor trafficking, sex trafficking, organ trafficking, and many subcategories. And ultimately, there must be one element of force, fraud, or coercion present in order to classify the crime as human trafficking. Again, we'll talk more about that as well. So to break that definition down more, again, lots of words, but we do refer back to this definition quite a bit during the presentation. There are three elements: the act, the means, and the purpose. So the act involves recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, provisioning, patronizing, soliciting, or receiving of persons. Ultimately, what we want you to hear here is that the act is not kidnapping or smuggling. The act can include anything from recruiting, providing a ride, transferring people to and from, harboring, keeping them. The means, again, the use of threat, deception, and force, fraud, or coercion. You'll hear those terms over and over. So let's really quickly
Lucas,
look
did you brush your teeth?
Let's look
Lucas,
real
did
quick
you
at
brush
what
your
force
teeth? Yes, ma'am.
or coercion is. I have kids, I get it. So human trafficking only needs one of these elements to be present in order to classify the crime of human trafficking. If one of the three elements is present, then the individual is not consenting to the act they're engaging in, and therefore they are victims of human trafficking. So examples of force would be physical abuse, as you might imagine, or assault, sexual abuse or assault, isolation, confinement. Examples of fraud would be maybe false promises for a job or a house, withholding wages, or maybe contract fraud, where you provide misleading information in a contract or an agreement. And coercion could include threat of harm to oneself or another person, debt bondage, psychological manipulation, confiscating documents. So ultimately, consent is key. It's important to note that even if an individual seems to consent in the moment, any consent given under duress is not consent. So jumping back to that definition, closing it out, the whole reason for all of this is the purpose of exploitation. It's defined as, again, commercial sexual acts, sexual exploitation, forced labor, forced begging, organ removal, forced marriages, slavery-like practices. And it's possible in some situations that a victim may initially consent to providing labor or commercial sex, but that initial consent is null and void when the perpetrator subsequently uses force, fraud, or coercion to exploit the victim to continue engaging in those same acts. And at that point, it becomes trafficking. So real quick, this is a myth or reality. Human trafficking is the same as human smuggling. This is false. Human trafficking involves the exploitation of men, women, and children for the purposes of forced labor or commercial sexual exploitation. Human smuggling involves providing a service, typically transportation or fraudulent documents, to an individual who is voluntarily seeking to gain illegal entry into a foreign country. So I like to, it helps me to keep it in mind. Human trafficking is a crime against an individual. Human smuggling is a crime against a border or a country. Now, it is possible that human smuggling can sometimes lead to trafficking. It's not uncommon that once an individual is smuggled across a border, they are then exploited. Just consider how vulnerable they are at that point. So at that point, the victim would become a victim of human trafficking if one of the three elements, going back to that definition, force, fraud, or coercion, is present. Let's look at specific definitions under human trafficking. Labor trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. There are different types of forced labor. There might be forced labor imposed by an individual or forced labor imposed by states. According to the International Labor Organization's 2022 global estimates of modern day slavery, there are 27.6 million people in situations of forced labor on any given day worldwide. And a total of 3.3 million children are in situations of forced labor. Moving on to the second main definition under human trafficking, sex trafficking. And again, these definitions should start sounding familiar. Sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of an individual for the purpose of commercial sex in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. So sex trafficking, again, is a narrower term within human trafficking used specifically to talk about those exploited within the commercial sex trade. One thing that both labor and sex trafficking do have in common is that they both require that element of either force, fraud, or coercion, but tactics of patronizing and soliciting are specific to sex trafficking. One thing to keep in mind here, as you see on the screen, is minors. Minors cannot consent to sex per federal law. So any minor engaged in commercial sex, in the commercial sex trade is automatically considered a victim of sex trafficking. And the matter of consent in these situations is null and void. So an example, there's a 14-year-old teenager, let's say a female, she is in the foster care system. She runs away from a really unstable situation. She's on the streets, she's looking for a place to stay that night, and she exchanges sex for a place to stay. Even though there's no third-party consent in that situation, because she is a minor, by federal definition, she's engaging in exchanging something of value for sex, she is a victim of sex trafficking. So there is a difference between consensual commercial sex and sex trafficking. So not all commercial sex can be classified as human trafficking. Adults who willingly engage in commercial sex without that element of force or fraud or coercion being present, they are not victims of sex trafficking. However, if an adult initially consents, but then rescinds their consent and is then subjected to any element of force, fraud, or coercion, they are then classified as a victim of sex trafficking. Elements of force, fraud, or coercion can be as simple as withholding wages, or blackmail, or psychological manipulation. And we will go further into those terms. So ultimately, we want you to keep in mind, don't fall into believing that victims of trafficking are being physically restrained. Consider the psychological manipulation. There's no physical chains. Additionally, consider what is entailed in consent. Consent indicates that there is a choice. There's a choice involved. And when there isn't a choice, is that consent valid? And secondly, as we've already mentioned, but just to reinforce here, because minors cannot consent, all commercial sex with a minor is considered sex trafficking, and that minor is a victim of sexual abuse and sex trafficking per Virginia Codes 1-228. I know some of you are not in Virginia, but this is our specific code for this. So I'm going to share a few statistics, but we do share that due to the criminal and underground nature of trafficking in persons, statistical data is generally underreported and consistently subject to change. The statistics that are found in this presentation are primarily taken from the United States Department of State, the United Nations, the International Labor Organization, and other really well-recognized NGOs, but we still hold them loosely because we understand that human trafficking is incredibly underreported. That said, these are the most recent global statistics on human trafficking as a whole. There's roughly 49 million people worldwide who are impacted by human trafficking on any given day. This industry grosses $150 billion a year. If that doesn't enrage you, I don't know what does. People are getting very rich off of selling other people. And then this is the second highest, most profitable criminal enterprise worldwide. So while the average age of trafficking is widely disputed, we do know that this issue does impact both adults and children. Megan, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, and just, when we think about the kinds of abuse that we are required to report as mandated reporters for children, for example, that's going to include physical, sexual, emotional abuse, as well as neglect. And so all four of those are part of that ongoing complex form of trauma that's caused by sex trafficking. So when that disrupts a child or adolescent's developmental trajectory in ways that you can anticipate. So that happens in pervasive ways, really across all developmental domains. So if a survivor survives into, a victim survives into adulthood, then it's really important background to remember as you're assessing and interacting with young adults and even older adult patients, that the average age of entry may begin and really be disruptive to a lot of the rest of their development should they matriculate into legal adulthood.
So this is an image of the United States, a heat map that is put out by Polaris, a leading anti-trafficking organization. So this map shows that every area in the US where a trafficking victim was reported, and these reports come in through the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So remember, human trafficking is vastly underreported, so there are many more victims than what is actually shown on this map. And you can see that the red and orange is the locations with the higher prevalence of numbers, and the lower, it's the blue and green. But you can see that every single state is impacted by trafficking in some way. In 2020, Polaris identified 16,658 victims, trafficking victims in the US, with the majority of those individuals being found in escort services. Polaris also noted that there was a significant increase in online recruitment that year by 22%. There was a 125% increase in Facebook recruitment and a 95% increase in Instagram recruitment. So the online world plays a huge role in this crime. And again, cases have been reported in every state, in all 50 states in the United States.
And so then when we take a look at, what's happening here in Northern Virginia, which is where we're both based, we can look at statewide information to begin with. Polaris Project recently published, I think their most recent numbers are 2021. 583 signals were received on the human trafficking hotline. In Virginia, a third of those were victims calling in for themselves. So what we're seeing there are numbers in the hundreds in terms of what's getting reported. But we at Reset 180, which is the Northern Virginia-based nonprofit that I'm a part of in Reston, Virginia, one of our programs involves text outreach to potential victims that are advertised online. So basically, we figure if buyers can find victims online, then we can also, reach out to them using the same technology. So we work with another nonprofit tech company called Freedom Signal, and they can detect the number of online ads for sexual services using AI to screen for multiple pictures or multiple contact information. So they can really determine the actual number of potential victims in any given geographical area. So I asked them to pull the most recent data that we had, and last month, what they reported were 477,264 potential victims in Virginia. So that's over 477,000 individuals being advertised illegally to sexually assault for a price. So we looked then at the 50-mile radius from our office in Reston, and we had 72,966 potential victims. So in the DMV, obviously that 50-mile radius includes Washington, D.C. and parts of Maryland, but we're still a sizable portion of that total statewide number, which is just shy of 500,000 potential victims in Virginia. So when we look at the number of crimes reported being in the hundreds and compare that to nearly 500,000 potential victims that are unreported, and you kind of hold that together with the complex trauma, the reduced life expectancy of those same victims, then you can understand our sense of urgency in offering this kind of training. I'll just add that Joy and I met 2 years ago when we went to Richmond to lobby lawmakers together about the need for this kind of statewide medical training to help close this gap. So it really does mean, it means a lot to us to be able to be here offering it to you now.
Right. So who are these individuals who are being trafficked? In this section of the training, we focus on the common victim profiles of a trafficking victim. Not all victims are the same. Ultimately, anyone can be a victim of trafficking, but there are some common vulnerabilities that traffickers tend to target. So let's look at that. So while any gender can be a victim of human trafficking and specifically sex trafficking, the vast majority of those being trafficked for the purpose of commercial sex or sexual exploitation and or forced marriage are females. And then this is a Virginia statistic from 2012. It's a little old, but I still like to include it. It indicates that trafficking victims, the majority of trafficking victims found in Virginia were women between the ages of 20 and 39. So while I do think that there's been a bit of a shift in this age demographic to include younger victims through online platforms, what this does tell us is that both adults and minor females can be victims of this crime in the United States and in our state specifically. Looking at children, you know, we have survivor advocates who review all of our trainings just so that we have people with lived expertise who are looking to make sure we're presenting in all the ways that are excellent. And so one survivor who viewed our content, you know, she made a point to say that if people don't believe that child trafficking is an issue within your community, take a look around. Because if you have an issue with adult prostitution, you definitely have an issue with child trafficking because it's just a matter of age. Ultimately, traffickers prey on vulnerabilities, and children are our most vulnerable members of society simply because they are kids. So 12% of labor trafficking is child labor. And then of that 12%, over half of those children are also victims of sex trafficking. We don't have a lot of great statistics to indicate how many total sex trafficking minors there are countrywide, but we do know that kids are regularly exploited. Freedom 424 has a relationship with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and they reported to us in 2020 that as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, was monitoring the dark web, they intercepted predators discussing the increase of online activities among youth due to COVID, and then how the predators, could use this to their advantage to exploit. They were even trading tips regarding how best to exploit these kids. So child exploitation is not accidental. People are being very strategic about identifying vulnerable youth and taking advantage of them. And then if that's not horrible enough, familial trafficking, another form of exploitation of kids, involves family members selling their kids for something of value. And in these situations, grooming isn't necessarily in these scenarios because the child is born into that exploitative situation and it's normalized for them. And the child knows no other way.
Yes, and as we see more economic strain, the number of families who would turn to this as a way to earn extra money in exchange for drugs, you know, just is increasing as well, but certainly over COVID in particular. I would say too, if you're interested, kind of switching topics, in kind of peer-reviewed journal articles across a wide range of disciplines, I definitely recommend the relatively new Journal of Human Trafficking, particularly the research that deals with pediatric screening, identification, and treatment within medical and psychiatric settings. So we'll link, you know, at the bottom a couple different articles, but there's one on recognizing suspected human trafficking in the pediatric ICU, for example. There's another on complex PTSD and trafficked children, and then, you know, there are others. So there's it's an easily searchable database. So if you are specifically working with the pediatric population, there are some other resources out there to be had.
And again, we have a source page at the end of the presentation you'll have access to where you can find all those links. So who are the traffickers? Ultimately, a trafficker can be anyone, and they don't just fall into one category. They come from all walks of life. They prey on vulnerabilities and they exploit that vulnerability. Traffickers are often selected for their ability to quickly establish trust with the victims they are recruiting. So as you look at this list of individual, you know, potential trafficking individuals, direct your attention to those photographs on the side of your screen. That first picture is a mother who trafficked her 8-year-old daughter, so parents can traffic their kids. The second is a teacher who was caught trafficking children. And that third image is a registered foster parent who was caught engaging in sexual acts in exchange for money with a child that he met online. Traffickers can be anyone. So if vulnerabilities can be exploited, what are those risk factors? This list is not a comprehensive list, but we've selected these specific ones because they do tend to be the most prevalent. And ultimately, you know, individuals can be impacted by those social determinants of health, those things that they were born with, they grew up with, they live and work with, and impact their health. And these determinants play a huge part in some of the violence and inequities that an individual may experience. So let's just look at these most prevalent risk factors that do put individuals at increased risk for being trafficked. Sexual abuse. 90% of children who are commercially sexually exploited, and you might notice that we do tend to focus more, just a side note, you tend to focus more on specifically on sex trafficking. We share some of those statistics because we as an organization focus on those, but we do want to provide both labor and sex trafficking, but some of these stats focus specifically on that, sex trafficking. So back to what I was saying for sexual abuse, 90% of children who are commercially sexually exploited have been sexually abused prior to that exploitation. So sexual abuse history is a major risk factor in a victim's profile. Relational poverty. By that, we mean there are many victims who are not privileged with a strong and healthy social or familial community. They might experience very little love and support. And this leaves individuals vulnerable to the wrong ideas of love. They lack that social support that might assist them when there's a need. Ultimately, this vulnerability can impact all of us because who of us doesn't want to be part of a community, who doesn't want to be loved and accepted? So ultimately, we all might experience relational poverty at one time or another in our lives, making us more vulnerable. That the foster care system is a huge risk factor. That lack of proper relationship and support continues into this aspect with foster care children who don't typically experience that normal familial relationship, and they are moved from one home to another with very little in their possession. Foster care kids really experience that relational poverty heavily. And studies consistently report that between 50 and 90% of child sex trafficking victims have been involved in the child welfare system as well. As far as LGBTQ plus identifying individuals, those identifying also make up 40% of homeless youth. They are more subjected to false ideas of love, survival sex, and sexual abuse. And they may also be vulnerable because of their lived experience. It might be negative. It might have discrimination involved. They might have harassment and abuse as part of their history. In 2011, the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice reported that 40% of sex trafficking victims identify as African American. And 58% of juveniles who are arrested for prostitution are African American. And please note here that this statistic was written when prostitution was applied to juveniles, but ultimately juveniles, they cannot be arrested for prostitution. They are victims of human trafficking. And lastly, poverty. The inability to meet basic needs leaves people incredibly vulnerable to and susceptible to manipulation. And when familial trafficking impacts while familial trafficking impacts all socioeconomic ranges, and it's not necessarily isolated to those who are impacted by low income. Many rural low income areas, you'll find family members who traffic their kids for drugs or money in those areas. And this is one of the most common forms of sex trafficking in the United States. So ultimately, what we want you to take away here is traffickers prey on vulnerabilities, and these risk factors are identified as vulnerabilities by traffickers who then manipulate the victim accordingly.
So,
you want to jump in here, Meg?
Yeah, I'll give one example. Susan Young is a Northern Virginia resident, a member of Anti-Trafficking International, and she speaks publicly and trains others on human trafficking prevention. She's been a keynote speaker at our gala event at Reset 180, and really bravely chooses to use her story to raise awareness. But her 15-year-old daughter was recruited by local gang members here in Northern Virginia at the movies with some girlfriends. She describes him as similarly aged, handsome, polite, seemed well-mannered, and harmless, and well-intentioned. And so he began this gradual but methodical process of grooming her and eventually convinced her to leave with him. Susan was among the small number of parents that recover their children once they are reported missing. Unfortunately, her daughter was found shortly after she went missing, before she was moved across state lines. But Susan describes the daughter that was returned to them was forever changed. Her journey of intensive treatment has been ongoing and complex, and the ripple effect of that experience definitely impacted the entire family. And so I often like to provide this example because the Youngs fit absolutely none of the above risk factors whatsoever. Both parents are highly educated, financially well off. Their 4 children did well in school. And by all accounts, they were living a very ordinary Northern Virginia life beforehand. During her daughter's grooming, she came home every single night until she didn't. And so There'll be some other stories and vignettes later on where you can see there are so many different ways that this happens, but it's important to keep in mind, even in Fairfax County, we've had documented cases in every single high school and at least half of our middle schools. And so the problem is certainly widespread.
So what does trafficking look like? I think a common misconception, what we hear all the time is that, people think trafficking is that scenario of the stranger danger, of the victim being abducted and taken, kind of like the Taken scenario in that movie. But in reality, traffickers will often take the time to gain the trust of their victim and to identify the person's vulnerabilities before they're trafficked. It's a very relational crime. The traffickers do this by identifying that vulnerability first. If you follow this equation on the screen, they identify the vulnerability, they form a relationship with the individual, they groom the individual, all for the purpose of exploitation. So it's very intentional. One of the two most common ways people end up being trafficked in the US is either through a romantic relationship or a family relationship. And one of a main tool to initiate those relationships for exploitation is the use of the internet or social media, sexting, which can oftentimes lead into sextortion. So remember, over 90% of trafficking victims knew their trafficker before the exploitation began. So not stranger danger. They knew their trafficker before that exploitation started. And regarding, and 40% of child sex trafficking victims were sold through a family member. Another issue that we definitely see is exploitation through illicit massage parlors. This is another very common outlet for trafficking.
And our organization conducted some research in 2019. At that time, we identified 85 of these in Fairfax County. I think the numbers have fluctuated up over 100, in the past, but each of these illicit massage, kind of businesses or parlors were listed as open, had at least one review that indicated sexual services were purchased inside. They often use a 5-star rating system like you would for an Amazon product review. And it is definitely chilling to read the way that the customers discuss their experiences and leave reviews for others. That report can be fully linked at the end, but I can tell you, I live here in Fairfax County in Vienna. I have 5 of these businesses on the main road that I live on. 3 of them line the property of my kids' middle school athletic fields. They're next to my dry cleaners and the 7-Eleven. I even had one that was in the office right next door to my kids' pediatrician office at some point in the past. So it's, you don't have to look too hard to find them when you know what to look for. And once you see, it's really hard to unsee. But again, it's definitely in our midst. And so I'll read just this quote briefly. It says, "Human trafficking is the only industry in which the supply and the demand are the same thing, human beings." And that's a quote by UNICEF in the United States. And so although we're only covering the basics of this issue today, we would certainly be remiss if we didn't pause and focus on those whose actions actually drive this multi-billion-dollar industry, which is the buyers. We do focus a lot on the traffickers because those relationships are more ongoing with victims, but it's the buyers who fuel the economic engine of this whole machine. And buyers can also be anyone, although I will say, here they're predominantly middle-aged men with disposable income. Sexual addictions to pornography often fuel that desire to play out those experiences they see in real life. And with the anonymity of being able to coordinate a purchase easily online, the risk of detection feels even lower. So at Reset 180, we do focus on buyer outreach at these illicit massage parlors. We offer sexual addiction recovery resources to buyers, because while their actions, if proven, would and should certainly be prosecutable legal offenses, in our capacity as a nonprofit community partner, we also see the mental health struggles behind their behavior too. And given the harm their actions cause, we really try and prioritize education and as much reduction of future harm as possible.
So that was the introduction, the baseline information on human trafficking. So take a deep breath, we are going to delve into this next section of the training where you will learn why it's so important for you, specifically as healthcare professionals, need to be knowledgeable about human trafficking. So take all the information you just learned and now apply it to your field. So you'll be exposed to human trafficking statistics as they directly relate to you in the medical field. So why the medical community? We referenced players before. They have reported that up to 88% of human trafficking victims have accessed healthcare while they were trafficked. 57 of responding survivors reported never having been asked any type of trafficking or abuse assessment questions during their visits. They're just not being identified. If you see the signs of human trafficking, you could be your patient's greatest confidant. You could be their eyes, their ears, their safety. As a healthcare profession, this profession is ranked as the 7th most frequent signaler for human trafficking reports. And so it's evident that the medical community is swarmed with opportunities to be able to identify and potentially support individuals impacted by trafficking. So here's another heat map, a different one, this one representing the locations of healthcare professionals who contacted the National Human Trafficking Hotline between December of 2007 and December of 2017. So during that 10-year duration, we can see that there were situations of trafficking, again, in every single state in the United States. And this is for those healthcare providers who knew the National Human Trafficking Hotline, who were able to recognize those signs and then report. How many do know that information? And that's why we're so grateful for this training. So victims of trafficking are often confined and subjected to dangerous, unhealthy experiences. Those who are sex trafficking victims are specifically subjected to unsafe sexual encounters and assaults. So because of this, victims seek medical care in a variety of ways. And if you know when and where you might come in contact with those victims, it might be easier for you to identify. Victims of human trafficking often prolong the waiting period before seeking medical care, and there's many reasons for that. We'll get into that. So when they do seek that medical care, it's that much more important. So they might seek care for a routine checkup, for mental health services, addiction treatment, pre-existing conditions, just for standard health issues not related to human trafficking, in an emergency, after an assault, in a workplace, for a workplace injury, and for gynecological or prenatal care. It's just a few. So clients or patients who fall within these categories are more vulnerable to being trafficked. And again, this is not a comprehensive list, but just something for you to be considering within your field. So those individuals who have substance abuse, individuals who are runaway or homeless, those who've experienced recent migration or relocation, individuals with mental health concerns, those experiencing housing insecurity, physical disabilities, or intellectual and developmental disabilities.
I do a lot of work in my practice with individuals across the age span with autism spectrum disorder. So, I might point out too that those whose social and communication styles often present challenges when it comes to making and keeping relationships can be even more vulnerable to believing a trafficker, especially when that person can identify their disability because of their participation in a group home or another place that's going to serve their increased need for support. So the same is true, as we mentioned before, in the foster care system. We have seen clients whose traffickers worked as maintenance or landscaping employees of those homes, with the real purpose of building rapport with teens in the group homes that they lived in, so they could later encourage them to leave. So we're so grateful to have so many mental health professionals here, and so I know we may have more folks here that are interacting with that subset on a regular basis.
We can delve into that. So ultimately, we want to share some physical indicators, some behavioral indicators, and some diagnostic presentations to help you. Not that the individuals, if you see these, it doesn't mean that the person is automatically a trafficking victim, but it will give you the lens, the perspective through which to maybe include human trafficking as part of the possible things going on. So as far as physical indicators, here is a list of some common indicators. Again, this is not a comprehensive list, but if you see individuals who maybe show signs of physical or sexual abuse, malnourishment, substance use, and this is a tough one, right? Poor hygiene or really great hygiene. You have some traffickers who want to really have marketability of their victims. So they want to make make sure that the hair, the nails, the clothing looks really great. So it could go either way on this one. Maybe significant dental issues, STDs, STIs, multiple pregnancies, high numbers of sexual partners, any chronic health concerns, or delayed care. It's also really important to remember that sex trafficking victims specifically, sex trafficking is a reproductive crime. So many sex trafficking survivors have a reproductive story and they may just not share it. The victims of sex trafficking often face reproductive issues as a result of their trafficking. And these could be here, the ones we mentioned here. It's not limited to this, but it could be pregnancy as a result of rape or prostitution, infertility from chronic, untreated, sexually transmitted infections, or even botched and unsafe abortions, or sexually transmitted diseases, HIV, AIDS, pelvic pain, rectal trauma, and urinary difficulties from working in the sex industry. And then just some other indicators you might observe without even having to interact too deeply with the patient just by watching. Does the patient appear younger than they say they are, their given age? Many trafficking victims actually are minors, as we've discussed, but malnourishment could also be a reason for this. Is the patient with a controlling individual, a companion, somebody who holds that individual's identification, maybe insists on interpreting for the patient, maybe refuses to leave their side? Maybe the patient possesses either a very lot or a very little amount of money. Maybe as you observe how they're dressed, maybe it just seems inappropriate for the season or for the situation. And then you might be able to notice certain brandings and tattoos. And so on this next slide, we actually share some types of tattoos that you might look out for. You know, the condition of a patient's skin can help you identify those potential trafficking situations. Tattoos are a common form of branding that the trafficker uses as a way to exert control or ownership over their victim. The International Journal of Women's Dermatology found that rashes and brandings such as tattoos were more likely in sex trafficked patients, whereas burns, injuries, and deep cuts were more likely found in labor trafficked patients. And oftentimes, those tattoos are on hidden places in the body. So as a healthcare worker, you may have access to areas of the body that other people won't see. And I will mention that there is a trend that traffickers are now adopting where they brand the victim with personalized jewelry. So the jewelry would still have some of these same, images like a $sign or a name. But now, if the victim is caught, they are required to tear that jewelry away and drop it so that any identification that would link the trafficker with that victim is now lost. Traffickers are getting smart. Specifically, some behavioral indicators. Here is a common list of those behavioral indicators, though, again, this is not a comprehensive list, but just to kind of get you thinking. So maybe you notice that the patient has real scripted answers or stories as you're interacting with them. Maybe they minimize the abuse or injuries they've experienced. They seem fearful or really hypervigilant or nervous. Maybe they're completely unaware of where they are, the date or the time. They seem unwilling or hesitant to answer any questions about the injury. They exhibit symptoms that might be related to depression or CPTSD, and they might refuse care and leave against your advice.
So if we take a look at even just possible diagnostic presentations that would be overlapping or potential misdiagnosis based on initial presentation, I won't read them all, but I've alphabetized them, and everything from really ADHD to trauma are the kinds of things that, if we're going to be legalistic and see how many boxes we could check, that we could see all of these things within pediatric and adult populations. So I do think it's notable. We really do see higher rates of actual dissociative identity disorder with this population, though, which stands to reason, because when you have no choice and no viable option to escape a sexual trauma in particular, your mind will often protectively take you out of your body, so to speak. And then when that mental escape's repeated over time, then DID, would be more likely to develop. But as you're thinking of differential diagnoses, I especially want to encourage you to think about every presenting symptom through the lens of complex PTSD, to consider if that's actually maybe the best primary diagnosis, given that it really is one that most victims share. So if we go to the next slide and kind of look at the differential here between these two, with PTSD, We're going to have intrusion, like somatic re-experiencing and flashbacks, etc., hyperarousal, including symptoms of hypervigilance, and constriction, like avoidance or numbing. And then if we consider what complex PTSD kind of adds to that mix, it would be all of the same criteria, as well as deficits in affective regulation, self-concept, and interpersonal relationships. So the types of trauma that I would say are probably known to cause more complex PTSD will be repeated childhood physical and sexual abuse, prolonged domestic violence, torture, genocide campaigns, and slavery. Now, there is some debate within our field about using the term modern day slavery, which is often used to describe sex and labor trafficking. But for the purposes of today, I certainly would include them as kind of predictable causes of complex PTSD. So I think it's also easy to see too, when you look at those criteria for complex PTSD, why there's so much overlap with things like personality disorders, for example. And, you know, because PTSD is present when early repeated trauma would create a less stable foundational baseline, as opposed to a single event that may happen later in life where you can return to that already established baseline. It's still possible to develop complex PTSD later in adulthood, though. So if we, go ahead and advance. If we take a look, though, at those extra three, categories for complex PTSD, those often get organized into these sort of 5 areas of thinking. We're looking for emotional regulation difficulties, disturbances in relational capacities in all manner of relationships, alterations in attention and consciousness, so primarily dissociation, adversely affected belief systems. So in the case of sex trafficking, that's often meaning that they shift into alignment with the trafficker's worldview, particularly of their own self-worth, as well as somatic distress or other forms of somatization. And it's important too to note here that the World Health Organization does recognize complex PTSD in their ICD-11 diagnostic manual, but it's not a distinction that's made in the DSM-5 at this time. But among those who are working with survivors, I'll say it really is widely referenced and generally thought to be a pretty helpful distinction, clinically in the field.
So we want you to understand the potential mindset of a client or a patient who may be a trafficking victim and how those dynamics of power and control may impact a victim, and making it, so that they don't want to talk or they don't even want to walk away from that situation. So as we go through some of these points, you can be looking at this power control wheel over the next 3 slides. So trafficking victims may not talk simply because they feel shameful of their actions or unworthy of help. Because traffickers are master manipulators, and they've conditioned their victims to feel that they are at fault for the position that they're currently in. So since most sex trafficking situations began through a relationship that has been manipulated, the victim may feel that they agreed to that initial situation and therefore they're to blame for their present state. However, again, going back to that definition, if force, fraud, or coercion is introduced, any consent is no longer valid. Traffickers prey on victims' vulnerabilities and use a plethora of tactics to maintain control over that victim. And many victims may feel that if they reach out for help, their trafficker will find out and harm that victim or their family in retaliation. So in an effort to avoid the possibility of retaliation, victims may choose to stay silent.
And so we already kind of compared PTSD with complex PTSD, and if we go a little bit further, there is this concept of trauma coerced attachment that was introduced in 2015 to kind of expand and deepen what's captured even in the complex PTSD literature, because the control and the abuse tactics that are implemented oftentimes by traffickers to induce this kind of complete compliance are so highly calculated and effective in these cases. They just do not naturally occur in all forms of complex trauma. So this is kind of an additional distinction. So trauma coerced attachment is intentionally built so that it can later be exploited. So trauma bonding has actually been the most common term that we've really used along the way to describe this seemingly illogical sort of bond between trafficking victims and their traffickers. But it has some problems and it's kind of too broad of a concept. So all kinds of people, right, can bond because of a shared traumatic experience. And even when no abuse of power is involved, people can help each other through a shared experience, like being in the foxhole together during a combat situation. But this is something more akin to Stockholm syndrome or systematic brainwashing, where we see idealization of one's captor. We can also lean on our understanding of like the complex feelings that are involved in abuse situations with domestic violence or childhood sexual abuse from someone on whom the child depends. So I would just, end with trauma coerced attachment is definitely a powerful and a really emotionally complicated kind of attachment.
So continuing, as we look at this power and control wheel, victims may not be legal citizens, so they may choose to stay silent because they don't want to be deported. Many trafficking victims have been coerced to commit crimes while they're being trafficked, and so they'll be fearful of arrest or any kind of law enforcement due to the crimes they've committed, even though they were forced to commit those crimes under duress. A power imbalance is a key component in trafficking. So many victims have little or no control over their lives. Many don't have access to transportation and are not free to come and go as they please. Additionally, many traffickers will try to control victims' access to their documents, their phone, their money. They have no access to any of that. So that type of control makes it extremely difficult for a victim to reach out for help. Children who are runaways are especially, as we've discussed, vulnerable to trafficking. And if a child is being trafficked, they may not want help simply because they're fearful of being reported back to social services. Some patients who are victims may be distrustful of the healthcare providers or the healthcare system for two reasons. Many traffickers, as a control method, have conditioned their victims to distrust anyone who is not them. And, Megan's talked about that a bit. Again, it's a control tactic. And then secondly, victims may not understand how the US healthcare system works, especially if they're not US nationals. And lastly, and the one that we see so many times, is that many victims just don't self-identify as a human trafficking victim. They don't see themselves as a victim, so they're not going to talk about it. They're not going to ask for help. And if someone doesn't see themselves as a victim, how do you expect them, in common sense, how do you expect them to reach out for help? So this particular point also speaks to the general lack of education and understanding around the whole issue of human trafficking.
Yeah, a number of people don't know that that's even something that has a name. They don't know that, they may or may not recognize how many other people it happens to. And I've certainly heard survivors just say, it just seemed like the next dumb thing I did, like in a string of other things that they had internalized blame around. So you might be more likely to see somebody if we're thinking about the kind of different responses, like the fight or flight response. I think we've got 5 Fs on here. I guess we love alliteration in our field. And so the flight or the freeze response, right, is what we might associate with somebody who's being victimized, who might be frozen up or immobilized, or who just wants to get out of there. But I will also say, do not rule out the fight response. Victims who are activated might present as exceptionally tough or offensive. So a patient who is mouthing off or who's ripping out their IV in your emergency room could easily be a victim as well. But when it's being aimed at you, it can make it much more challenging for all of us to recognize and respond to the pain and the fear that are underneath there. So when a patient's triggered in your medical setting and you recognize they're in that limbic, fight, flight, or freeze mode, the goal becomes offering opportunities and techniques to ground the patient first as best you can in your setting, re-engage that parasympathetic nervous system so they've got the best chance of possible to engage that higher order cortical processing again and give their best possible thinking and decision making in the moment. So it's worth it to take some time and try to focus on that. So I would say here, if there's one journal article that I could highlight as a key resource for psychiatrists in particular, it's this one on trauma coerced attachment and complex PTSD informed care for survivors of human trafficking. It's again from that Journal of Human Trafficking. And we'll give you links for that. So Dignity Health's Medical Safe Haven program, put this out, and they have clinics operating in Sacramento, Redding, and Northridge, California. They've really been leaders in this field of research, and as you'll hear later from survivor leader Liz, they've really centered the perspective of survivors' lived experiences with the medical system as they've developed their treatment models. So we don't have time to review it fully, but I do want to highlight some of the recommendations for pharmacological treatment. So this chart here, you can see with the circle that begins at the top is where the experience of being trafficked has already taken place. The effects of complex trauma begin to change these reward pathways, making them either oversensitive or dampened. And then as we kind of cross that dotted line, on the circle down again, then if the victim actually makes it into some kind of a safe placement where there's the option for treatment and is removed from the trafficking environment, we still have everything under this line to contend with in terms of their ability to choose to stay in the safe placement. So recidivism rates are so high for a number of reasons, many of which we covered as we're looking at those symptoms of complex PTSD. But the mood lability that often increases soon after they are removed is a really big one. So our focus here is kind of intervention at this phase of initial stabilization. So the end goal is establishing enough of a baseline and functioning to allow for that best decision-making possible for each individual when they're in your care. So for example, if you know that a patient is having difficulty sleeping, you want to find out more about that. So if you're prescribing something to aid with falling asleep or staying asleep, that might not be indicated if the difficulty involves nightmares, which is really common with this population. In that case, clients may be trying to avoid sleep to prevent the nightmares and getting stuck in that tortured sort of sleep. And so something to help them stay asleep longer would just make it worse. So this research supports what we have really seen anecdotally in the effectiveness of the adrenergic blocker prazosin in particular, which really helps prevent nightmares as well as insomnia, and it generally just reduces symptoms of hyperarousal. I know I've had a client who would subsist on 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night for weeks on end to avoid nightmares. And so this particular medication was a real game changer. And I've spoken with Megan Caesar, is the clinical director at Youth for Tomorrow, which has a sex trafficking unit for like a program for sex trafficked youth here in Virginia. And she said they use this particular medication with great efficacy really regularly as well. So the other categories of medication for initial stabilization obviously would be antidepressants for depression and anxiety symptoms, although that can take a few weeks to see full effect. And then also the use of atypical antipsychotics would be the other category of medication. And certainly we need more research, I would say, with this particular population, because these are, there's a lot of side effects that go along with these as well. But it's thought that the atypical antipsychotics like these would decrease the intensity of that fight or flight threat response on a cortical level. So the aim is to help disrupt the cycle of trauma-driven emotional lability that we see right after exiting. So the way they describe what we see clinically is like, just like with addiction on its own, neurotransmitter signaling pathways are altered, which results in dysregulated reward circuitry and impulse control and cognitive control. So if we see a similar dysfunctional activity with chronic trauma, when the trafficking victims are in these long-term repeated fight or flight responses to threat, and then they're rescued or recovered, they experience that sudden decrease in activation, and they can go through a kind of withdrawal when that intensity is removed. And I've heard survivors talk about this where, they feel just antsy and sort of agitated. And sort of the neurological reward pathways in human trafficking survivors are altered, especially if you have the presence of complex PTSD or trauma coerced attachment. So The big picture is to keep in mind most of the patients you're going to see will be somewhere in that repeated cycle of overactivation and withdrawal, and that high adrenaline experience of being in the game can just leave them feeling like safety feels boring. It can feel really agitating. And some of that craving for that high intensity experience is really an attempt to regulate the nervous system, and it really can have a neurological basis. So if we look at the next slide, it's the same slide, but just taking a look at a couple of these categories of medication. So this is where the pharmacological interventions are being aimed. So antidepressants might be beneficial at any point during the stage of trauma, but here they're suggesting prazosin, for example, would be really well timed to target that initial hypoarousal and nightmares. And then, if you can do that, you might be able to impact the emotional lability that follows next in that cycle. And if not, if mood intensity and lability also have to be addressed, then you might want to consider that atypical antipsychotic, being added if you have the time while they're in your care. And so I just think, just lastly, it's important to note these kinds of treatments might only be needed temporarily to halt this cycle and stabilize patients long enough. So resources like food and safe housing and case management can be provided, and then additional treatments like trauma-informed therapy can be offered. But with the chances of a victim returning to their trafficker being so high, if you're in a position to educate your patients on why they might be experiencing these kinds of feelings and these symptoms, and then offer them some options for that initial stabilization, it could make a really big difference in terms of them being able to accept some of the resources we're going to talk about later.
Thanks, Megan. She's such an expert in this, and that is a perfect segue into this next section of, if you do observe a potential victim, you have a small window of opportunity to provide some of those key next steps. So with that, we'll be sharing the PAIR tool in a moment, which allows you to have a trauma-informed approach to providing victim assistance. So as we prepare to review that tool quickly, here are some things to keep in mind in preparation. Some next steps. So ultimately, you will meet basic needs of your patient. So if your patient is with someone, you want to attempt to get them by themselves at all costs, because you shouldn't ask any questions in front of a potential trafficker. Separating that patient from the third party, accompanying that individual in a health visit is a crucial first step before implementing the PAIR tool or any kind of human trafficking screening. And the third party's refusal to allow that patient to be alone with the provider may be an indicator that he or she is not concerned about that patient, but is actually fearful of being divulged as a trafficker. So a few strategies you might consider in separating your patient from that controlling third party. You could suggest that it's policy to assess the patient alone. You could indicate that a test or a scan is required of the patient. You could ask the third party to step out of the room for paperwork, or to schedule a follow-up appointment or a referral. But ultimately, if you are unable to separate that third party from the potential victim, you would not want to move forward in providing any educating or screening, because you could put both yourself and that patient in harm's way. Even if you don't see that right away, maybe after they leave, that patient could be really hurt. If the patient requires it, get a translator. The patient can be asked if he or she requires an interpreter, and the denial of interpretation services by the person accompanying the patient may be yet another red flag indicating victimization. Do not have the person accompanying the patient be their interpreter. And lastly, just, a baseline hospitality thing: offer food, offer beverage, show the victim where the bathroom is, make them as comfortable as possible. Reassure that victim. You want to become really well informed about the common healthcare issues faced by victims of human trafficking, including sexually transmitted infections, substance use disorders, any kind of mental health problems, or physical trauma, so you can confidently assure your patient that you are there to support and educate them and give them choices that relate specifically to their situation, which again is why we love having this training. You want to, as you prepare to provide education, you'll understand more as we share the PAIR tool. There's a step 2 where you provide education to your patient. You want to reassure them they're not in trouble, that this is a safe place for them if they want to share anything. So it's imperative to establish that rapport in case your patient does want to divulge that he or she is a trafficking victim. And you could say things like, to help them walk through this, I'm so sorry this has happened to you, or this is not your fault. That simple statement right there goes such a long way in building rapport and helping establish safety. You can acknowledge the presence of trauma symptoms. You could say, no one should have to endure that abuse. You want to respect an adult victim's decision whether he or she is ready to report. Is this a step you want to take? You can attend to the the patient's immediate needs and safety. You could say, do you feel safe leaving when you're discharged? Or are there any specific needs you have right now? You want to create a sense of safety, not trust. A common verbiage that traffickers and pimps use is the word trust. So that word no longer has appropriate meaning in a victim's life. Healthcare providers should not inquire about trafficking specific details, but they should know their state mandated reporting laws for both adults and children, as well as vulnerable adults. And we will touch on that a little bit later. Be sure to communicate, especially with your adult patients. They always have a choice. This is the thing that has been taken away from them as victims. You want to give that back to them. You want to be mindful that a victim may prefer a male or a female clinician. Some individuals might prefer female individuals. Patients might prefer a male clinician because females have been the ones that have caused the most harm during their trafficking experience. In fact, that, a survivor we work with, that was her story. She would rather have, male healthcare providers because those females hurt her so much during her experience. So don't assume. Consider the balance between evaluating a patient's medical and non-medical needs while recognizing the importance of providing a safe and comfortable environment for the patient. Sometimes that evaluation process can be triggering, so communicate often. Again, this feeds right into that last point. You want to avoid that re-traumatization. As a healthcare provider, if the patient gives indicators that they are uncomfortable, you want to make sure not to push too hard. You want to be aware that certain questions you might ask can be triggers, and you want to allow them to share in their own time at their own level of comfort. And then, is human trafficking included in a list of mandated reporting? And I know, again, we have people outside of Virginia here. So you want to know your state's laws on this. Again, victims have little or no control over their lives or actions. So strong-arming them into a choice is not an option. And as mandatory reporters, you have a duty to report any case of child abuse or elder abuse. It is important, though, that adult victims don't fall under the Virginia Mandatory Reporting Law as defined by 63.2-1509 of Virginia Code. If you have an adult patient who you believe is a victim of sex trafficking or human trafficking in general, you can provide them with a phone number for the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and you can provide them with numbers for the local law enforcement or the Virginia State Police tip line, and you can encourage them to call, but you cannot report for them, especially to law enforcement without their consent, as this is a violation of HIPAA and also of trust. And if an adult is older than 60 years old or an incapacitated adult, 18 years or older, you can report to the Adult Protective Services, and they will continue that investigation and contact law enforcement as needed.
And that's really what we were talking about, Joy, right? In terms of if you've got somebody you think it's pretty obvious that there may be an intellectual disability and it kind of falls in that gray area, then that would be the appropriate place to pass that on, as opposed to you deciding to go directly to law enforcement or anything.
And your workplace should have, hopefully, human trafficking policy established to help give you guidance in some of these spaces where you're not sure. And at the end of the presentation, we will provide all those key numbers. So if your workplace does not have human trafficking policies in place, you can take some of this information back and be, the advocate to put those in place to make your jobs easier and help you know how to report.
Do you think do we have time to go through this? I know we definitely want to
love to share this, but it looks like we're short on time. So we're going to jump right in. Thank you.
What I might just share at the very end, I mean, Jennifer's story is, it says here, trafficked by her father and then by a partner and re-traumatized in the healthcare system. Maybe I just read some of her, her story is powerful, but some of her remarks about just the medical system itself at the end. What she felt was re-traumatizing for her was things like making me get fully undressed in front of people, having to repeat what happened to more than one person, getting shamed from the provider for taking the morning after pill, being surrounded by police, nurses, and doctors, hearing what nurses would say about me right outside my room. No one told me it wasn't my fault. I was treated like I was the one who did something wrong. Many times she said I was asked, why didn't you just leave when you had the chance? And so her advice was, be careful how you ask things and who you ask them in front of. Keep an eye out for things like tattoos, their placement or their design, little or no eye contact, not wanting to answer your questions, refusing care, and refusing medication. So I thought that was really some of the most important advice directly from one of our survivors.
Thank you. So we'll share the pair tool and then we'll close out with this. So pair tool will provide a QR code on the following page, and this will allow us to walk through the process of allowing a patient to determine if they would like more resources. So this tool was created by Dignity Health. Megan already mentioned this organization, and it's specifically for the health community. It's a tool for the health community to have a more trauma-informed, victim-centered way of approaching human trafficking, as opposed to screening tools that often trigger or re-traumatize the victim. And again, we've said you cannot make the person receive help. The individuals may not be even identifying as a trafficking victim. They may be scared. We're not sure all the situations. So your job ultimately is to educate them and provide them with that choice, the very thing that has been taken away from them. And if they do want to get help, you can walk with them through the process of calling those different numbers, calling law enforcement if they want, because they will need an advocate in you. So go ahead, and if you can scan this code, I'll give you a second. And as you scan that, this will take you to the pair tool link. And it's a 4-step tool that we really love to use in the healthcare system. Scan that. I'll just leave that up there as we go into the first step for a moment, because I want to make sure that everyone gets the opportunities. In the first step, ultimately, we've already kind of gone through many of the things that you would do to provide comfort. The first step is P, provide privacy. So as you provide comfort, as you provide safety, and you're aware of your language, you will ultimately be providing a safe, private space for these individuals as you separate them from their trafficker. So during this step, this is where you would make sure that all those basic needs are met, make sure that you explain the limits of confidentiality before discussing any sensitive information, and ultimately don't discourage the patient from disclosing trafficking. That individual should feel safe and in charge of their own disclosures with you. So that's that first step. The second step would be to educate your patient. And this is where this presentation will really come in. When you're educating a patient, a suspected victim of trafficking, you want to remain non-judgmental and normalize the sharing of that information. To normalize that, you could have a brochure or a safety card that you could go over with the patient, letting them know this is your standard practice with all of your patients. That would also offer a visual of the information. So you can offer physical copies of that education content to the patient and then communicate they could take that on and pass it on to someone else they know. Be sure that that material also has a QR code so that the information can be scanned on their phone. Some patients may not feel comfortable or safe taking something, a tangible card. If they decline the material, please respect their decision. Educational information could also be in brochures or pamphlets or pocket cards around your examination room, in your waiting room, or even more discreetly in the bathrooms. I know a lot of places do that. The material could include contact information for organizations and resources that can support individuals impacted by human trafficking. So if you scan that link on the third page of the pair tool, it identifies different areas of support resources. If you can identify those multidisciplinary locations of support ahead of time, so that that way, if someone comes through your doors who needs those resources, you don't have to scramble. You have all those resources queued up ahead of time. Again, you might want to consider creating some sort of brochure with a QR code to allow that discrete access with the basic human trafficking information and available resources for you. And you'll see on this next slide, this is an example of a card that Freedom 424 has created, and we're implementing in our local healthcare, our healthcare systems. As we educate our healthcare providers, we have given them this card. On one side, it has just basic human trafficking education. On the back, it's like the main numbers to call. And then when they scan that QR code, it takes you to a web page that has resources for the whole state through DCJS, and then a regional resource link for here in Central Virginia. You could create something like this or contact us. We'd be happy to provide you with ours. The third step after you educate, so provide privacy, educate, is then to ask. This is where you would allow time for discussion with your patient, ask them some of those open-ended questions like, is there anything you'd like to share with me? Or have you ever seen this type of thing happen to you or someone you know? So if there are some red flags that you've been able to observe, you can ask about your concerns. You could say, I'm concerned about your health because maybe you have bruises around your neck and you've indicated that you don't have a stable place to stay right now. Or, what you've shared doesn't seem safe and I want you to be safe. Or you don't have to share details, but I'd love to provide some resources to you to help you. Please note you want to limit your questions only to those that are needed to determine the patient's safety, because again, you want them to disclose at their own rate. You don't want to pull it out of them. Let them share as they feel safe to do so. And lastly, you want to respect and respond. And honestly, this is the hardest thing, because if the patient denies victimization and indicates they are presently safe, you want to respect their wishes and you don't want to continue to push the conversation. And sometimes it's hard to leave it at that if you really have that gut feeling. If you do have safety concerns for the immediate time frame, you could discuss calling law enforcement with your patient, and you can offer hotline numbers, again, the card, the resources, if they're willing to take it. Of course, if minors are involved, you would be required to report the situation as a mandated reporter. If the patient does accept and request assistance with accessing service, one way you can support is to help provide those introductions to a victim advocate. You can arrange a private setting for that individual to call some of those resource numbers, and even be there to call with them. They might not be comfortable navigating some of the systems, but ultimately you cannot, nor should you, make a person receive help. Again, they may not identify as a victim. They may be scared. Your job is to educate them, to provide them with a choice, and to connect them with resources as needed.
And most of the time, your efforts are probably going to be more like planting a seed. So it's important to be realistic. The most probable outcome after a first encounter is the patient returns to their trafficker. The number of times that we have heard snitches get stitches, like you can go in, but you cannot talk, and you will, you'll have physical punishment when you do get back out again. If you say anything to anyone, there's so much intimidation involved. So it's an unfortunate reality, but when we consider, the reality of that trauma coerced detachment, we understand why. I have heard survivor leaders speak, though, about being approached sometimes 6 or 7 times before they were finally in a position to consider trying to leave. So if you can keep good records of suspicion in the case that a patient does come back to you again, so the next person can see your suspicions, consider your language as you provide notations, but just consider that you may be just one part of their journey. But the dignity of being received and respected and cared for well can make such a big impact.
So we do have a few examples of screening tools. If you scan that care tool, the third step under that ask section says that if it's available and appropriate, you can use evidence-based tools to screen the patient for abuse or neglect or violence. So we share this with the caveat, use your discretion with these screening tools because they may re-traumatize, and consider just reviewing the tools to pull some suggested language and themes while being very cautious about direct implementation. But in that third step of the PAIR tool, they say you can incorporate, with care. So this green bomb tool was created. If you want to take a picture, or you'll get this presentation at the end, we can email it to you. But the green bomb tool was created through the Maryland Human Trafficking Task Force, and it provides some basic screening questions if you suspect that a youth is being sex trafficked as you walk through that PAIR tool with them. The second screening tool, again, as the third step under ask, use it with care. This is another resource specifically to help you identify youth who may be labor trafficked. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on here because we're running short, but we'll send it to you. And then lastly, here are just some example questions you might gently ask while in conversation with your patient, or, as they're sharing some of the story, you could pull the verbiage to kind of know the direction you might want to go. We don't have time at
Ms.
this point
Cover,
to share.
thank you.
Yep.
Go ahead, please.
Yep, we don't have time to share this story of Liz. We'll send that out. So we just want to end with
Name is Liz, and
these numbers to call, because when patients do disclose, these are really important numbers to know. The National Human Trafficking Hotline, we want to encourage people to call and gain resources there. If a patient is a minor, follow those mandatory reporting laws by calling that CPS state number. And then, of course, 911. And then the Virginia State Police Human Trafficking Unit is listed. You can call #77 or text VSP to that number 847411. Lastly, if you're not sure who to call, you can report, or you're not sure how to report, you can use us as a resource, and our number is listed online on that slide there. And ultimately, I know we're running short. Thank you so much for taking your time to go through this with us. This is our website. Feel free to reach out. And we'll just close out with this QR code for the post-test. So as we end our time, please scan that and complete that so that we have the pre-post information.
Thank you very much for this wonderful informational talk. We have some comments that are very important. I'm hoping that people can stay for a few minutes longer because we started a few minutes late. So I'm hoping that we can ask those questions. So there is a question about what's the minimum information we need so that we can report. So if they deny a safety issue, we do not have all the information parts to fully define trafficking yet, and they have left the office. Do we report?
Is it a minor or an adult? Again, it would really depend on your, and again, you can jump in here too, but we always encourage, no matter what, the National Human Trafficking Hotline number is a great resource that you can call to ask those specific questions. And you can, if it's an adult, you can call and just ask for guidance without violating HIPAA. So we encourage people to just use the National Human Trafficking Hotline as a resource in those situations if you're unsure of what to do. But then if it's a child, we always encourage to report suspected abuse no matter what.
And then I think you're going first to Child Protective Services, because you can get someone on the line at any time, day or night. And then from that point forward, they can help advise you if there's an immediate danger or if it's something that they're going to look into further, and they'll follow them.
There is another question that in the risk factors, we did not list cognitive challenges. People who are cognitively impaired or may have some challenges may be more prone. I don't know if it was not listed, it wasn't a comprehensive list, or do you think that that's not a risk factor?
No, it was only really briefly on one of the slides, but intellectual disabilities, absolutely. And other cognitive challenges are certainly there. And sometimes those coexist because a lot of traumatic brain injuries are common. And so even if you have an individual who may not have had cognitive, and memory and other functioning challenges before their trafficking, there's such a high frequency of head injuries that may be something that comes later on. But certainly, as a predisposing factor, especially if there's somebody who, again, is in the system in some way where those factors would be known to somebody else, like a group home or some other kind of school or program where they're getting services for those reasons in particular. We've definitely had cases here in Northern Virginia with that exact presentation for sure.
Another comment when you are talking about how to have the suspicion for trafficking is by a physician saying they may refuse pelvic exams, it will hurt too much. So these are things that should raise red flags that there's something going on by somebody refusing exam. There are a couple of comments about the peer tool that it is excellent. Thank you for sharing that. And let me see if there is any other question. Great talk and an important topic to discuss for safety of our youth. Thank you. Most of the things are thanks. And can you post the link on the chat? So maybe Kathy, you can post it in the chat too if you haven't already. And then there is for the post test. When can we expect our CME certificate? Well, that information is later. It will be coming out by email tomorrow. But also it's so much information that you have given. Dr. Gerbracht and Ms. Cover, you have really, it's been so informational because we don't even suspect we always think of trafficking victim as soon as somebody asks them that they are they being trafficked, they are immediately ready to accept help. You have to really work with them to get to that place to even help and to do it well. So there is so much information, so many tools in there. Would it be okay for us to share your slides with people who have attended? Because then they can look at all these tools. Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'll send it to Kathy after tonight, after this presentation. I'll send that to you, Kathy. And as far as the post-test, Kathy, do you have that link or do you need that as well?
No, I think she's posted that already in the chat. So I think in the interest of time, I will not read you all the comments that are thanking you for an excellent informative presentation, but we're seeing a lot of comments in the chat. This has been a very informational evening. Thank you both for this wonderful presentation. We're gonna leave the post-test scan on for a few more minutes. So anybody who hasn't scanned it, please scan. So, and please do the post-test so it let us know how effective this lecture has been and how to improve these presentations in the future. Please be on the lookout for other CME lectures from Washington Psychiatric Society and Apna DMV. We're going to be sending those out. And I want to thank everybody for attending, and will thank you both for presenting. What a wonderful talk. Anybody can unmute themselves, or if you can, we will imagine that everybody's putting in chat, so they're clapping.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very helpful and informative.